There's a well-known story where Ānanda, who I believe was the Buddha's closest disciple, tells him how incredible it is that even though the concept of dependent origination is deep and looks deep, he also finds it completely laid out in plain sight, simple and obvious to him. But as he makes this claim, the Buddha immediately discourages him. He kind of shuts down his remark right away, and he assures Ānanda to not think this way. He says, "Don't say that, Ānanda, because the teaching really is profound and it looks just as deep as it is." And he explains that it is exactly because people don't truly truly get it, this concept of interdependence, or pierce through the meaning, that everyone's gotten all tangled up like a messy ball or string, of string, or a knotted heap of thread and reeds, as the Buddha describes. And it's kind of intimidating, because if Ānanda, who was arguably the Buddha's closest student, thought it was simple and became so criticized for it or discouraged by it, then where does that leave the rest of us? And usually when we learn about this, we're shown this really complex chart with 12 different links. It starts with ignorance and covers things like 2 separate rebirths and consciousness entering a womb. And while that's really interesting from a historical perspective, and it holds a lot of weight for traditional practitioners, it can feel dense to really study these things, to study something like the Abhidhamma, for example, which is very technical. And it's not part of the Pali Canon, as far as I know. And it can be, some might see it as speculative or just plain confusing, too sophisticated, too subtle. But the thing is, hidden inside this pretty sophisticated 12-link formula is a much shorter psychological version that explains why we're unhappy in this very moment. So since the Buddha said that these things are deep enough to tangle us up, we're going to try a bit of creative analyzing to cut through these knots by snipping away the extra parts. We can find the practical heart of the teaching that actually changes how we live. So the great part is that this core stays the same whether we do investigate or analyze or not. So if we ever feel lost in the complexity, we always have that center to return to. Now, normally people see dependent origination as a way to explain how rebirth works across 3 different lifetimes. That's the long 12-link chain where ignorance from a past life sets the stage for conditioned consciousness to shape a new life in a new body. And then this leads back to clinging and being born and dying all over again. And like I mentioned, that's historically significant and explains a lot of traditional Buddhist views on how rebirth happens. But it's still a bit of a difficult thing to wrap our minds around or use in our day-to-day life. But some scholars like Frowalner, or Gombrich, and Bronkhorst think that the earliest forms of this teaching were actually much shorter. You can find these shorter chains in texts like the Kalahavavita, or rather Kalahavivada, or the Madhupindika suttas. In those early versions, it's not about the big picture of cosmic rebirth. It's focused squarely on the mental gears that cause suffering right now, from moment to moment. So we'll call this the short chain because it shows the real sort of engine behind our dissatisfaction. The mechanism of it So let's walk through how it works. Let's imagine that we are the ones talking to the Buddha instead of Ānanda. And we're sitting there thinking the Dharma is actually quite easy to grasp. It's pretty straightforward. It makes sense. So we go up to him, we explain what we think we know with our big mouths, and then the Buddha just scolds us thereafter for being foolish. So the very first link in this shorter chain is our own body and mind. The kalahavavida, I keep saying that wrong, kalahavivada, kalahavavida, sorry, kalahavivada. It calls it name and form. So this is name and form, while the Mahānidānasutta describes it as our sense organs and the things we perceive. But basically, we're just living in these bodies within this reality, and that's our starting point or baseline. But for example, we have ears. So when the Buddha speaks, that mixture of the sound of our ears and the consciousness of hearing is what Buddhism calls contact. And that's really the second link, and you can't really avoid it. If you have ears, you're going to hear him scold you or criticize you. And right when that contact happens, a feeling emerges. It's just that immediate, pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral tone or feeling that follows any interaction with the world. That's our third link. In this situation, the feeling is definitely unpleasant. It's important to see this as just raw pre-verbal information, these impressions. It isn't completely suffering yet, at least not in the chain of causality. It's just the basic sting of the impression. The fourth link in the chain is the real turning point, and it's where craving comes in. And this is when the mind starts to react. This craving for wanting something or craving to get away from something, that aversion. It wants to get away from a negative feeling, and it wants things to be different. It wants a better feeling to arise, and then it wants that to last forever. And this is always like this with all sorts of situations when we experience conveniences or inconveniences. We don't like that. So since we're being scolded in this scenario by the Buddha, we just want that uncomfortable feeling to pass, because nobody likes being called out or criticized. And this is exactly where our mental filters and interpretation start working overtime. Trying to figure out how to get rid of the discomfort, or how to keep the making of the merry, they say, and the good company going. And then we hit the fifth link, which is clinging. We start getting, opinionated, very attached onto our perceptions and our beliefs, our identity. And it can go a few ways depending on the situation. Maybe we decide to stand firm in our own view. We're so certain about it and think that the Buddha is just making these overthinking, he's overcomplicating things. We cling to the idea that actually we're quite smart and we get it. Or we might, in contrast, we might go the opposite direction, decide that he's the ultimate authority, he's definitely right, and we're attached to him, and considering ourselves completely ignorant and foolish, but totally reliant on him. But either way, we're busy building up a version of ourselves, and sometimes the wrong version of somebody else, the wrong version of the Buddha. Whether it's the smart person being treated unfairly, or the ignorant person who deserves a lecture. And that's what leads to the whole mess of suffering or dukkha that we feel. Because there are a lot of ways that we perceive things, and so much of it is just delusion, with too much sense of self. Now, in the Mahānidānasutta, it shows up as arguments and fighting. We might actually try to talk back to the Buddha and tell him that it's not as hard as he's making it, and we might just spend the rest of the day arguing with ourselves about, or like in contrast, why we said something so dumb or ignorant. The Mahānidānasutta Sutta describes it as mental proliferation, which is like a non-stop internal debate. We might get lost in a cloud of making excuses for ourselves or just beating ourselves up mentally. So we kind of harm ourselves over the interaction all day, make ourselves feel excessively guilty or something. Maybe we torture ourselves because of the wrong speech. And maybe we can't even sleep at night when we have an argument with someone. Our head is just spinning with thoughts. Well, this last link gets described in different ways. But you can basically think of it as the rumination and deep stress. And the final result of this whole chain is just a world full of conflict and anxiety and drama that we've trapped ourselves in. So the real question is whether we can actually break this chain, and if so, how do we do this? Well, there are a few areas where it's just not possible. We can't really cut it at there are places in the chain of causality where it's not theoretically possible. You can't cut the cycle of causality at contact unless you plan on staying in a coma or some incredibly deep meditative state forever. The world's going to keep happening. Things are going to keep unfolding, events, regardless of how we feel about it. We aren't going to be able to, likewise, we won't be able to cessate causation at the feeling stage either, because painful sensations are just, they are inevitable to arise, whether we like it or not. Even the Buddha felt physical pain. But there is a place in the chain which serves as kind of a weak link. There's a place where that chain can be broken. And this gap between the links is between feeling and craving, actually. So the goal is to learn how to feel pain and feel impressions, lows and highs, without immediately becoming desperate for like getting away from something or turning to something that's more pleasurable or exciting. So the way we actually pry that link open is through mindfulness. Because think of mindfulness as the lever that helps us stretch out that small gap over time. It lets us practice just sitting with the feeling, sitting with the impressions, whether they're good or bad, without automatically reacting with our typical cravings and aversions, the feelings of wanting to get away or do something else. So we can learn to just observe that unpleasant feeling, that it's happening, without piling on the extra layer of these preferences and judgments and points of views that are very biased and personal, like I hate this, or this is, I like this because it is like this, it fits into this demographic or this category, or I need to change this right now for me to like it, or I don't like this, etc., instead of just it is what it is. So in the long run, if we can cut out the craving, then the clinging and the attachment goes away too. And that whole mountain of suffering just finally breaks, it cessates. Now in the real world, we might just manage to loosen those links a little, especially when we're new to this, or we have, this is a work of a lifetime. But even that even that can make the suffering feel pretty significantly less heavy and manageable, even if it doesn't completely disappear, because many of our habits and sufferings just do not disappear overnight. They, dwindle when they're going away. If they're attenuating, it takes time. So the Buddha's teaching on dependent origination is definitely one of his most brilliant ideas. But for our own practice, it's good to not get lost in the complicated parts, and it takes a long time to develop comprehension, both of the, at least comprehending our own experience and our own ways of dealing with impressions. But by sticking to these six core links, we can move away from the more speculative things that tie us in knots and focus on what was likely the original version of this teaching. And that version shows us a direct path to mental freedom right here in the present. Because the Buddha famously said, "One who sees dependent origination sees the Dharma, and one who sees the Dharma sees dependent origination." And by this, he didn't mean we should just memorize, this wheel of causation, but instead he meant that we have to strive to see this mechanical nature at work in our own lives, in our own psyche, right in front of us and within us. And the key to this whole chain is what we're calling craving or thirst, or this is the link that we want to break from. And the practical aspect to breaking from this chain of causality is the fundamental practice of constant watchfulness from moment to moment, as this is mindfulness. And just to make sure that nobody misinterprets the meaning of mindfulness in this context, it really is a constant and unbroken self-awareness that we must keep engaged and active all day and all night if we can. This is really how we work our consciousness, how we exercise it. It's not sitting down for 10 minutes a day and going through some feelings, because you're not going to get anywhere doing that. That is just how to make your life a little bit easier, but that's not the real practice of mindfulness. Mindfulness is strengthening willpower, strengthening concentration, and you only do that by practicing rigorously. At least an hour a day, but it's supposed to be, the consciousness is supposed to be engaged at all times. That's the natural state of consciousness. So we have to do that with effort at first, and then as the conditions gradually diminish, the samskaras diminish in our mind, it becomes easier and easier over the years.